Well, hello, everybody. So glad that you could make it to this session today. My name is Andrea Hoff, and I'm going to be talking all about grants. One of my favorite topics in the entire world, and I'm so glad to be able to be here and share that with all of you. I hope by the end of the session today that you have the ability to be as excited about grant seeking as I am. I love to find money for people. It's one of my all-time favorite things to do in the whole world. And if I have the ability to share some good tips and tricks to all of you, then I'll have met my goal today. So before I really launch into things, just to let you know a little bit about myself, like why am I the person that's here talking to you about this information? So again, my name is Andrea Hoff. I'm the owner and president of a company called You Thrive Training and Consulting. I've been writing grants for about 23 years. During the 23 years, I spent some time, about 12 years in a nonprofit organization where I learned grant writing because as a nonprofit organization, we needed money to sustain our programs, like many of you out there. After those 12 years, I moved to the public sector where I actually worked for local governmental offices as a funder. So I spent 13 years doing that work and got to see kind of both sides of the coin, both being a grant seeker as well as a grant maker. A really great perspective to have as I continue my grant seeking endeavors. It's taught me so much. And again, information that I really want to be able to share with all of you. I am what's called Grant Professional Certified, a GPC that comes through the Grant Professional Certification Institute. And I'm also the current president of the Miami Valley, Ohio chapter of the Grant Professionals Association and a member of the Association of Fundraising Professionals. I've taught grant writing courses at the university level. Absolutely love to do this work. And I'm so thrilled to be able to share with everybody that last year in 2020, which was my first full year working independently as a self-employed person, I raised just over $15 million. So again, I like to brag on that. I mean, why not? That's $15 million that went to good services, great work in the community, people who need those services. And again, I just love to find money for other organizations who are doing such great work. This is going to be very much a foundational course. Okay, so very high level, but a really good overview about what's like everything in the world of grants that you kind of need to know in about less than an hour. Okay, so, consider this Grants 101. With Grants 101, I like to start with the basics, like what is a grant? Now, I know all of you are out there saying, I know what a grant is, like why is she explaining this to me? But I do it because I've been in these settings long enough to know that people throw that term around and they don't always know what they mean. And there are different types of competitive processes out there that are not technically called grants, but we tend to call them that. Okay, so when we think about the term grant, you can see that on the slide here. Grants are funds that are awarded for programs or services or research or whatever it is that you're applying for, but it is considered a contribution. It's a donation. It's a gift. It's something where the funder is like, here, I'm signing this check and this is your money, and they give it to you up front for you to do some good work with it. Now, just because they're giving you that money up front does not mean that it isn't tied to a legal contract. Okay, it absolutely is. So you become contractually obligated to spend those dollars in the way that you put into your proposal. Think about it as the fact that when you write that grant proposal, you are submitting that to the funder, telling them what you're going to do with those dollars if you get awarded. That proposal actually becomes an addendum to your legal contract. So you are contractually obligated to spend it in the way that you said you would in that proposals, all the deliverables, the way you would spend the money in your budget, all of that. Okay, those are funds that are awarded up front. Now, that is different than what we call a contract or a procurement contract. Okay, that is reimbursement for specific units of services provided. Okay, think about it this way. This is where you then provide the service, and then on the back end, you submit an invoice and you get paid for it. Okay, still a competitive process. You still have to get an award for it, But there's something for nonprofits to think about when they go after funding opportunities that are actually through a procurement process as opposed through an actual grant. That just means that you have to have enough cash on hand to be able to provide those services, knowing that you're not going to get paid until the back end. Typically once a month invoices. I've seen some go even longer than that. But now also think about how long the funder has to pay that invoice. I've seen some of them go 30 days. That's pretty standard. I've seen them go up to 90 days, right? And so do you have that kind of cash on hand where you can front the money and then get paid, maybe sometimes months later? That's a little bit different. Both of those are different than what we call a cooperative agreement. Okay, cooperative agreement is actually a contract. So not a grant, but a contract. And so that means you are getting reimbursed after the fact. You have to have that cash money up front, cash on hand up front. But what it does is it implies a substantial interaction between you and the funder. This typically means that the funder knows exactly what they want you to do, and they want you to do it in the way that they've specified. And so they may mandate certain things, that you attend certain meetings, that you go to certain technical assistance or coaching sessions, that you go to certain trainings. Those are called cooperative agreements. Years ago, the only places that I ever saw, funders that I ever saw doing cooperative agreements was at the federal government level. I'm seeing much more of those now at the local and state government levels as well. So, collectively, we call all of these grants. We just do. And that's because regardless of whether it's a grant, a contract, or a cooperative agreement, they are all competitive processes. That means that you are competing against 20 other, 200, 2,000 other, whatever the case may be, organizations that are applying for the same money. And you have to show why you are the best candidate for it. Okay, that's what we're going to talk about today, is how can I give you some of those tips and tricks to make you more competitive when you are seeking and securing those dollars. For simplicity's sakes, we're going to call them grants for today, okay, for today's purposes and training. All right, but just know that the difference. I had one boss who got really angry when I called them a grant, because they weren't grants, they were contracts, and he wanted to make sure that everybody understood the difference. When we think about who gives out grants, we really can put them into 4 different buckets. Okay, we have corporations that give out grants, we have foundations, we have the government, and then we also have what I'm calling, okay, this is my term, which is why it's in quotation marks, special interest groups. I realize that that term has political connotations, and I don't mean it in that way at all. So please know that. Really, we have no other name for them. But I'll go through each of these. And if I have any just kind of recommendations to give all of you as to how you can be a little bit more competitive when you're applying to those particular funders, that's what we want to do. All right. We're going to start with corporations. There are corporate funders out there, and you might be asking yourselves, well, you know what, when you think about what corporations are in business for, what is their bottom line? Well, their bottom line is profit, right? So why would corporations be in the line of work of giving out grant funds? There's a couple of reasons, right? Number one, corporations reside within communities, and they want to show this kind of responsible corporate citizenship within the communities that they reside. So oftentimes those foundations will only fund out to organizations that do reside within those communities. So definitely when you are looking for corporate funders, you will want to take a look at your surroundings. What corporations do you see? What retail businesses do you see within your own communities? And then you can go and see if they have a corporate foundation. Okay, one way that you would know that you would probably be eligible because you reside within that community. They really also want to be visible within that community, right? So more people are aware of what they do, and they're aware of the philanthropic things that they fund within their own communities. Now, corporate foundations do function within 2 different kind of methods. Okay, the first one are corporate giving programs. So corporate giving programs are not separate entities of the corporation itself. They just belong within that corporation. But they give out funds. Sometimes that is cash funds, but you can also think of corporate giving programs as a lot of in-kind services as well. So it may be a place where the corporation gives their employees a paid day off so that they can go volunteer for an organization for free. So that would be considered an in-kind donation of time and services as opposed to a cash gift. That's very different than a corporate foundation, where a corporate foundation is actually a separate legal entity from its parent organization, okay? But it works on behalf of its parent organization, and it gives out funding in that way. Many corporations have both of them, right? Some of them will do things like where employees will donate and the corporation will match that donation. So a lot of them earn their dollars that way. When we think about why, what we can learn from understanding corporate funders, like why should we go after corporate funding? This is what I want you guys to think about. This concept, this key point to remember of what's in it for me. Okay, if we go back to the reason why corporate funders give money, it's this one right here. It's to be visible within their community. And it's not entirely altruistic. Now, I don't even mean that in a bad way, because if a corporate foundation wants to get some money out into the community and my organization needs money, I'm all for it because it's going to be put to good use. But what that does mean, and what it can mean for us as grant seekers, is that we want to remember how we can tell them that we're going to help them be visible in their community. Every time I write to a corporate funder, that means I'm going to say in my proposal how I'm going to market their logo, their brand. I'm going to put their name and their logo on every press release. I'm going to put it on every handout. I'm going to put it on, if it's a capital funding, I'm going to put it on the building. I'm going to put it on the vehicle. I'm going to put it in a cement post on the corner of the lot, whatever that case may be, because that's something that's going to speak to a corporate funder, because it's helping them to be visible in the community, which is one of the reasons why corporate funders give out money. And you see lots of different examples that I have here on this slide, which are corporate funders that are in my community. Now that's very different than what we call foundations, okay? Foundations exist for the sole purpose of giving out money. That's why they exist, okay? So it really is to give money out to organizations or individuals to achieve their goals and their missions, your organizational missions. Now, there are two major different types of foundations. There are public and there are private foundations. So public foundations are what we call community foundations. They are considered public foundations because they have to show that they are generally supported by the broader community. And what that means is that their income has to be at least a third from gifts, donations, contributions, and no more than 1/3 from investments. Okay, now that is very, very different than a family foundation or a private foundation who, those funds come from wealthy families who may have one very large endowment. They invest it and they never have to go looking for money ever again. Okay, two very, very different things. Some things to keep in mind about that: because public foundations typically have to generate support from the public, from the broader community, they typically will like their name, their logo, their brand to be marketed. So again, if I'm going after public foundation dollars, I will write that into my grant application, how I will put their name, their brand, their logo on flyers, brochures, documents that I create, etc. Family foundations, some of them want to be known, many of them do not. And so that's always a question I would ask a family foundation. And many of them will say, no, we want this to be a private charitable cause. You're like, okay, so we're not going to necessarily write that into our grants language because that wouldn't speak to that particular funder. You see a couple of examples of public foundations that I have up here, just to give you a little bit of insight as to what is the largest foundation in the United States. I don't think that this is going to come to any surprise to any of you. In 2020, it was the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation with $46.9 billion with a billion dollars in assets. At the end of 2020, they had a little over 1,500 employees. They were employing 70 additional ones every month. It's a lot of people, but that'll mean something even bigger to you when you compare that to the fact that 90% of all foundations have 3 employees or less. So it is a large foundation and the largest in the United States. Then there are government grants. So it's like, well, why does the government give out money? And it is because the government's role is to fill communities' needs, right? But they can't always fulfill it themselves. And you know what? Sometimes they shouldn't, because you guys out there who are running your nonprofit organizations, you're the experts in what you do, whether that's food pantries or homeless services or behavioral health services or whatever the case may be. You guys are the experts in that. So as opposed to the government taking all of those services and providing them internal, which would just make our government systems even bigger, right? They fund those dollars out to all of you who are the experts in those services. And there's efficiencies and effectiveness that grows because of that. Government grants can happen at lots and lots and lots of different levels. At the local level, that can be at a very individual jurisdictional level. It can be a city, it can be a community, it can be a county, and that can go up to the state. And then we know that there are also federal grants out there as well. I tell people all the time, particularly smaller or newer nonprofit organizations, if you are just getting into grant writing for your organization, do not start here. Don't start with government grants. Go back to your corporate foundations, go to those public and private foundations, get your feet wet with grant writing with those. Because with government grants, we are talking about the distribution of taxpayer dollars, public dollars, right? And because of that, there are so many more strings attached. They are the hardest to get. They are the most competitive, and they have the most strings attached. So the administrative burden on the back end is much more stringent. They're much harder to manage on the back end. For nonprofits who don't have the administrative staff or capacity to be able to do that, you don't want to accidentally get yourself into a situation where you get a grant award and then you poorly manage it because you just don't have the capacity for it. Okay, start with those corporate foundations and those public and private foundations. Build yourself up into a government grant, making sure that you have the capacity to be able to manage it. But you know what? The truth is, the reason why government grants are far more competitive is because they have the biggest pots of money, right? Especially at the federal level, those are your multi-million-dollar awards that you can go after. And they're really fun, but you have to get your feet wet and work your way up to that. Now, this fourth category that I told you guys are called special interest groups. You'll understand that a little bit after I describe it a little bit more to you, because it is nothing political at all. I just don't know what else to call it. They do not have a name. The truth is there are groups, organizations, companies that will put competitive processes out there for grants to help them to fulfill their own missions. This tends to be something like, for example, professional associations. So, I mean, once a year, I'll apply to the National Grant Professionals Association for my local chapter so that my local chapter can run a regional or a statewide grants conference. Okay. That Grant Professionals Association doesn't fall into any of those other categories. They're not a corporate foundation. They're not a public-private foundation. They're not the government. They're kind of the special interest group that doesn't fit into any of those other categories. Some other nonprofits, typically larger ones like a statewide nonprofit that have really broad serving missions. I'm working with one right now called the Ohio Suicide Prevention Foundation. They are a nonprofit themselves, but they give out mini grants essentially to suicide prevention coalitions around the state of Ohio. So that's the category that they fit into as well. I called that a mini grant because these tend to be much smaller pots of money. Could be $1,000, could be up to $5,000, something like that. But you know what? Don't discount those small pots of money because you can still do really good work with them. All right, when we get into the actual process, one of the first things that you guys are going to do is you're going to read what's called a request for proposals. Now, I like to start with this because we live in a world of acronyms, and I don't want people to get confused because there's so many of them out there that really means almost the same thing. I mean, what we are talking about is a document that's released by the funder that tells you what is required of you if you are going to apply to them, okay? It's called a request for proposals, RFP. That's probably the most common acronym that we use to describe that document. But you might also hear RFA, request for applications. That used to be only a federal term. I heard that from the federal government in the past, but I've seen some tricklings of that to state and local governments, request for applications. There's also a request for information. That one has a little bit of a different connotation. Sometimes that there's not money attached to that. That's when a funder will want to just engage you to see who's going to be interested in applying for this, and if so, what is it going to cost? In that way, they're trying to figure out what their process is going to look like and what it would take for them to release some dollars. At the same time, I have seen competitive processes and they just call it an RFI. That document's called an RFI. So there you go. FOA, funding opportunity announcement, is another one. And over the last several years, I've seen more and more of the last two, NOFO and NOFA, notice of funding opportunity and notice of funding announcement. At the end of the day, you guys, they all mean exactly the same thing, okay? And the first thing you're going to do is you are going to dive into that RFP and you're going to try to discern the good information that comes out of that. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we go through our time today. It kind of becomes like your guide, your roadmap, everything that you need to know to apply. All right. Before you do that, though, before you actually apply, the very first step that I always tell every organization to do is this. You really want to assess your organization's grant readiness. Okay, please do not go into the process of spinning your wheels and putting hours and hours of staff time into going after something just to find out that the reason why you aren't getting grant awards is because your organization is not grant ready. Okay, here's what I mean by this. One of the things that funders are going to be looking for is that you are a credible organization. You're a credible organization that has credible staff, qualified staff, that has credible programs and projects that you are applying for, that you know what you're doing, that you are fiscally sound, that you know how to evaluate your services, et cetera, et cetera. These are the things that you want to be prepared for. I'm going to share a document to you, and you guys are welcome to have a copy of this. Let me pull it up really quick. And it's a basic checklist. You guys can go through this checklist and say, what do we have in place? What do we not have in place? Those things that we don't have in place, we really need to start putting them into place, okay? Not only is this going to make you more grant ready when you're initially starting your grant seeking process, but as you're going through the process, when those RFPs drop with very little lead time, like some of them, it's you have 2 weeks from the time the RFP drops to apply. 2 weeks, not enough time. Having all these documents and having all of this prepared ahead of time is going to make you ready to respond very, very quickly as you need to. And you see all the different sections that it includes. I'm certainly not going to go through the entire list with you guys. You will have a copy of this. But this is a fillable PDF, right? So I can check it off. I can take it off. Agency information. You're collecting all of this good information about your agency. You know, your business plan, your strategic plan, your fund development plan, minutes of your board meetings, stories or testimonials from people that you've served, agency publications, etc. You know, this list is also just an aha moment for some organizations because they'll go, wow, we're lacking a lot of this information. Okay, we need to do some work on our organizational development process before we start grant seeking. Okay, can absolutely give you that. When we get down into like staff information, it'll talk about your TO chart, your table of organization chart, a list of all your staff and their qualifications, your management staff or leadership staff and their contact information, all of their resumes and their position descriptions. Collect all your financial information that you have an annual organizational budget, you've had a recent audit, all your financial statements, and then it's very specific to the program or the project that you would be applying for, collecting information regarding that as well. Your logic models, your evaluation plans, descriptions of your target populations, descriptions of your evidence-based strategies or curricula that you might be using. all of that great information. And then if you are also applying for federal government grants, please know there is an entire process, multiple phase process that you have to go through to even just be eligible to apply for federal grants. Okay, this is a document I am gifting to all of you. All right, but please start there. Start there, do some great organizational development work before you get too deep into your grant processes. All right, once you decide to apply, what I really want people to understand is I hope you have good writing skills. Good writing skills, just in general, is a wonderful, wonderful place to start. But grant writing is a little bit different than other types of writing. It's different than academic writing. I tell you, when I was teaching at a university, my students, and I was teaching at a graduate level program, my students were phenomenal writers, but you know what they were? They were phenomenal academic writers. They knew how to write research papers because that's what they've been doing for the last, 4, 6, 8 years of their life. And your grant proposals should not read like a research paper. Now, let me give you a caveat. That is, of course, unless you are writing for a research grant or a highly technical grant. So if you work for the military or maybe a healthcare system, or if you work for a university that's doing research, actual research, or something very highly technical, aeronautical engineering kind of stuff, then yeah, it can sound like that. But outside of that, I live in the land of social services. It shouldn't read like that because the reviewers, the people who are going to read this, they don't sit in that space. Okay, they don't have a context for that information. What it should sound like is what's called persuasive writing. We are trying to persuade those grant reviewers that we have a project, a program, a service that is more credible, that is more likely to succeed, more likely to be high quality, more likely to be effective than anybody else. And that's what I mean by persuasive proposal writing. The very first thing you can do to write persuasively is to think through the funder's eyes. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, funders exist to be funders because they want to fulfill a need in the community. You can think about it like this. There's a situation as it is that exists as it is today. And then in their mind, there's a situation of how it ought to be. There's what is and what ought to be. And there's this gap in between the two. That's where their priorities land. It's in that gap. It's how do we bridge from the need, the community need, the people need that we see in our community today. And what we really want is this end goal. And how do we fill that gap? Okay. In thinking through what that gap is, we have to identify what do we want as an organization in our programs that we're selling to a funder, and what do our funders want? What does our funder want? Because those two may be the same thing, but they may not be the same thing. Okay. They may look at a situation like childhood poverty, and they can have one idea of how they think that ought to be addressed. So they may think, well, they need to do employability with parents. And you may think, well, no, I want to address child poverty, but I want to do it in a way where we're doing kindergarten readiness, right? Getting those young people set up for success. Those are two different things. So part of us thinking through the funder's eyes is learning as much as we possibly can about that funder. Where do they sit in this headspace of this situation in their community that they think ought to be fixed? And what are their ideas for that? What are their current priorities? And please know that funders' priorities change from year to year. So just because you ask them that question once doesn't mean you shouldn't go back to them and ask them that question again, or research it on their websites or whatever the case may be. Identify what their priority is. And then what we're doing is we're figuring out, is there an alignment between the funder's priorities and our organization's mission and our priorities for how we get the work done? If we cannot say that there is, that is not a funder we want to go after. We would be just setting ourselves up for failure. But if we can find that alignment, let's go after it, right? But we have to do that homework first. I've certainly met organizations who've said to me, you know, I've applied to that funder 5 times and they've rejected me 5 times. And it's like, okay, let's step back and figure this out. And half the time it's because there is no alignment between what the organization does with their overall mission, nor what they were proposing as a program or a project, and what the funder wants to prioritize at that given time. Okay, thinking through the eyes of the funder. Now, once we've identified some really good funding opportunities, what we really want to do is go through this process to determine whether or not we want to apply. I use this expression where I said, you know, we don't want to spin our wheels and go after things that are not going to be fruitful for us, right? And you're never going to get all of them. I certainly don't mean that, but you also don't want to, you know, submit 10 grant applications with 10 rejections. So this is what we want to think about. The first thing is relevance. Do we want to do this? Okay, this starts with digging through that RFP. Now, let me show you guys an example. This is a very old RFP. By the way, I've seen RFPs as short as 2 pages. I've seen them as long as 200 pages. I am still a person that prints them out in paper. I'm sorry for all of you environmentalists out there, but I need to see and feel it and highlight and put my little flags on it. And this is what I do. I dig into this RFP. I make notes in the margins, and I'm figuring out this first question, relevance. Do we want to do this? So I'm looking for things like eligibility criteria. Are we even eligible based on their criteria? I'm going to look at the total number of awards that they're going to give out, because there is certainly a difference between if they say, I'm going to give out 2 awards versus 60. Definitely tells you about your competitiveness. And my rule always is if it ever says 1, that says they have already decided who they're giving those dollars to, that award to. I know that sounds weird, but it's true. If it says 1, they've already figured that out. Okay. We're also going to look at the amount of funding that they're going to give out and look at, is it worth it? Right? Sometimes the deliverables are so demanding and they want you to do all of that and everything else under the sun, and they want to give you $20,000. And you're like, I can't do all of this for only $20,000. Okay. So look at those funding awards and figure out, is it really worth it? Timeframes, project timelines. Oh, match requirement. Is there a match requirement? Because that can be you know, an absolutely we can do this, or we don't have the match, so we can't do this. Okay, first thing we want to figure out, do we want to do this? The second one then is feasibility. Can we do this? This means logistically, do you have the ability, the capacity to write it and get it out the door by the deadline? And there are a lot of things to think about with this, right? We're going to look at word, character, page limitations. There's a difference between writing a 2-page narrative and a 25-page narrative, for example, right? So that's something that we really want to think about. We also want to look at collaborative partnerships, right? If they require a lot of collaborative partnerships take a long time, right? To build partnerships, to get the MOUs, the memorandums of understanding written, to figure out what partner is playing what role within the project, those take a while. So that's something to think about. And then the other feasibility is who's doing this work, who's developing the project design, who's doing the research, who's writing it, who's writing the budget. Is this a single person in your organization doing everything, or do you have a team of people that you can work together on this? Okay, logistically, can you do it? Feasibly, can you do it? The next one is probability. It's not just can you get it out the door, but can you be competitive as well? Right? And so we really have to think through our organizational strengths and areas of weakness in comparison to the funder's particular views and their priorities. Okay. Our credibility is only good if it's something that the funder considers and deems to be credible as well. So we have to look at it through that lens. Another lens we really want to look at through our competition is if we have what I call credibility statements and qualifications. So, you know, if I'm writing an application on, you know, academic attainment for homeless youth, you know, do I have a track record of having provided that service? And I have lots of accomplishments, lots of credibility in that space. Okay. And then the other thing about competitiveness is we really want to think through who else might apply. I always encourage people to put on your imaginary. This is my imaginary funders hat, right? Putting my imaginary funders hat on my head, and I'm thinking, if I was this funder, is there just an obvious organization in the community where if I was that funder, I would obviously give the money to this organization because they are just so well positioned for it. It's almost like you read that RFP and it's like, oh, that RFP was written for that organization. If that's the case, then I'd reach out to that organization. I've done that on several occasions, and to find out, are they planning on applying? And sometimes they are. And I go, okay, I may not go after that if I know that they're better positioned than I am for it. But sometimes you find out that they are going for it and you're like, okay, is there any chance for us to partner in this? So maybe they're the ones who go after it, but you get a chunk of the pie, right? You get a piece of that pie through that partnership. Or they may say, no, we don't plan on applying for it. And so there, your biggest competitor is now out of the way. So you're like, okay, probability just went up a little bit. We might go after that. The last thing that we think about is, can we manage the grant if we get it? And this is a really significant discussion that organizational leadership ought to be having, because you only get a first time to make a good impression. So you don't want to get a funding award and then manage it really poorly. And what ends up happening is you're burning a bridge with that particular funder. Okay. So I would say if that is in question, if you're like, not sure if we can absorb the administrative burden to manage this on the back end, I've always just said, then let's pass on that one. Okay. 4 different things. I actually use this as a checklist when I'm trying to decide for an organization whether or not they should go after a particular funding opportunity. If I can say, yep, relevance, yes, feasibility, yes, probability, yes, we can manage it, then we are good to go. Okay. If it's not, then we've got some work to do before we should go after that particular funding opportunity. All right. Whirlwind of information, you guys. I hope you are sticking with me through all of this, because what I want us to spend the remainder of our time together on is what a typical grant application looks like. And you can see the multiple components that go into it. My goodness, we could spend 45 hours going over this. So you're going to get it in about 20 to 25 minutes. And hopefully, again, just some really good tips and tricks for you guys to strengthen and really make your grant proposals much more competitive. Let's start with this concept of an LOI, a letter of inquiry or a letter of intent. And those terms get so confused. They actually do not mean the same thing. Those are 2 different things. So a letter of inquiry is almost like a question. You are inquiring, am I allowed to submit a proposal? Many funders will require you to submit an LOI, and then they will either say yay or nay. Yes, you are invited to submit a full proposal, or no, you didn't quite cut the mustard on this one, so you're not going to be allowed. You do not have permission to submit a full proposal. Okay, that's a letter of inquiry. That's different than a letter of intent, which is not a question, it's a statement. It says, I intend to apply. Many government funders will do this when they think they're going to have a lot of responses. So the federal government will say, we're releasing this RFP nationwide, and we need to know if we're going to get 200 responses or 2,000 responses, because setting up our grant reviewer process is very different based on that number. They will also use that information to geographically map out where they expect to get applications for those particular services when they want a geographic distribution of those funds. So that's a letter of intent. Both of them, though, are doing exactly this, what you see on the screen. They are looking for, do you meet eligibility criteria? You're not eligible, it's immediately thrown out, okay? Do you meet their priorities? If it doesn't, it's immediately thrown out. Do you meet all of the mandatory requirements? If it doesn't, it is immediately thrown out, okay? And yes, please believe that they are intentionally trying to decrease the number of applications that they receive, because they always receive more than they have the ability to fund, always. Okay, so that's the purpose of that LOI. Start with that process. And you know what? It's a good thing, because you don't want to spend so much of your time, your staff's time, writing a full proposal just to find out that you aren't going to meet certain criteria, right? If you can write a really small LOI and find that out, you've just saved yourself time and saved them time as well. Okay. Another really typical section in any grant proposal is what's called an organizational profile. Who are you, right? They want to know a little bit about you and your organization. So this is really that one section of a proposal that I tell organizations, write your organizational profile and then copy and paste it. This is the one section you can copy and paste from proposal to proposal to proposal, because it just is who you are. What's your organization's name? What's your mission and vision statements? What is your history? What's your role in the community? Why do you exist? What's your purpose? Who do you serve? Primarily, do you have a target population that you specifically serve? And you can see that they're really looking for these things. Are you a qualified organization? Right? They want to know that you're qualified. If you have certifications, if you have accreditations, this should go in this section. They're looking for credibility statements. Okay, this is what I mean about this section. Now, there is one part of this section that you do not copy and paste. Start with one paragraph that is your organizational profile that can be copied and pasted into everything. That very last paragraph ought to be your credibility statements and qualifications specific to the project that you are applying for this funder, okay, for this particular grant. And that's going to change from one grant to the next because you might be writing for multiple projects, okay? One tip I would also say about this is you always want to leave with this, what I call a wow statement. You want them to read this section and go, what? I mean, literally like a gut emotional response. Wow, that's a cool organization, right? And so what do I mean by this? Awards that you've received in the past, outcome achievements that you've been able to get in the past, any type of waiting lists, like, so many people are waiting for the services that you have to provide, that you have a wait list of 500 people for your services. Those are the things where it's like, wow, this organization is needed in my community, and this project that they're proposing is needed in this community. Okay, lots of different things. I also tell organizations this is also a self-reflection point, right? If you go through and you're talking about your organization and you're like, well, wait, where's our wow statement? And you can't think of one, we've got some organizational development work to do, and that's okay, right? We just need to know where to start with all of that. The next section is what's called a problem statement or a need statement. I always tell people this is one of the sections that takes me the longest to write. So always be prepared for that. It's basically telling your funder why your service is needed. You have to define the need in your community, the need in the specific target population that you're serving, right? It's something that is very clearly related to your organization's mission and your ability to provide a solution to whatever that community need is. If it doesn't connect to your organization, it may appear to be what we call a mission sway. Like we're a behavioral health organization, but we're applying for money to be a food pantry. They might see a disconnect and go, okay, now we have a red flag. So something that is clearly tied to your organization's mission and your ability to do something about that need. When I say it takes me the longest to write it, because it has to be well supported with evidence. They're not just going to take your word for it that there's a need in the community for that service. Prove it, okay? Prove it with the evidence that's well documented. So this is a section that requires data and research, okay? While you are including data in this section, make it easily digestible. Excuse me, you make it easily digestible. Again, remember when I said this should not read like an academic journal or a research article. And I always tell people, if you have a really data heavy sentence or sentences, finish it with a descriptive sentence, right? So if I say 18% of children in my community are living in poverty, I'm going to follow up with a sentence that puts an emotional illustration in their mind. So I'm going to follow it up with something like, that means that over 1,700 children are living out of cars and don't know where their next meal is coming from. Okay, it's really saying from an emotional point, well, what does that mean 18% of children live in poverty? Okay, well, this is what that means. It helps to provide that illustration in their head. It puts a human face to the problem, okay? Know that your problem or your need statement should always be focused on your clients, your beneficiaries, whoever in the community is going to benefit from the services, not on your organization's need. So you may say, well, we need 3 full-time equivalent, 3 FTE staff. That's not your need statement, okay? That's the solution, right? You're going to provide the solution by hiring staff to do the work, but the need is actually what the need is within your target population, within those beneficiaries, okay? That's what's really going to speak to your funder. After our problem or need statement, we're going to tell them what our goal, objectives, or outcomes are. Always think about this as their ROI, their return on investment. They want to know we're not just funding you as an organization, you as a program or project. We're not just funding you to provide those services. We want to know what we're going to get out of it at the very end. What are the intended results? Okay. So starting with your goal statements, think of the goal statement as your really big picture of what you're trying to accomplish. This is pie in the sky. This is if I could wave my magic wand. This is a large ultimate goal that we would like to achieve. Now, these typically do not need to be quantified goal statements, typically because they can't be quantified, and that's because they are so pie in the sky, so very big picture. Now, let me give you guys some examples, several of examples that you see here on the screen. Like every family in Franklin County will live in a nurturing environment. All young women will have the opportunity to obtain a college degree in science. Every Montgomery County citizen will have access to library services. All residents will have healthy meals to eat every day. Every young person will have a bright future by obtaining a high school diploma. Okay, so you see, it's very exhaustive. It's very inclusive. It's very pie in the sky. It's very visionary. Think of it almost like a vision statement when you think of the difference between a vision and a mission statement. Think of it almost like a vision statement, but it's that thing that is constantly drives the work that we're doing. This keeps us on our path. This keeps everybody on that same trajectory to reach that goal. Now, let me also say this. Not every funder defines goals, and we're going to talk about objectives and outcomes next. They don't always define them in exactly the same way. So, all right, this is how I'm defining a goal statement through the research that I've done, mostly through United Way of America and the Kellogg Foundation, through all of their research around goals and outcomes. But a funder may say in an RFP, give us a measurable goal. If they say that, you're going to have to find a way to quantify it because they mean it in a different way. Okay, something to think about. Now, definitely when you get to objectives or outcome statements, now we are talking about things that have to be quantified. Okay, we're really talking about not just how many people you're going to serve, not just how many deliverables you're going to provide, how many programs or services you're going to provide, but what are the benefits to the individuals that receive those services, right? And think about it as being quantified in some sort of measurement of change. Your individuals, your patients, your clients, your consumers, whatever you want to call them, your communities, if you're doing more community-based programming, they come to you at one particular point in time, and they need to leave it in a better situation, right? So whether that's an increase in knowledge that they've gained through your programming, a knowledge in skills, you've built some sort of skill within them through your programming, or even some sort of like positive attitudinal change, it's still change, or even behavior change that they've experienced as a result of participating in your programs. Okay, this is what we're talking about, and this is what we're measuring. Now, let me give you some examples. A really weak example, and I tell you, when I was serving as a funder and I saw objective and outcome statements like this all the time. Okay, so for example, students will learn drug refusal strategies. Okay, well, what exactly does that mean? How many students? What does drug refusal strategies mean, right? Just really weak. I could strengthen it this way. Look at this one. Of the 20 students who participate in the program, 80% of them, or 16 students, will learn a minimum of 3 drug refusal strategies within the first 6 months of the program. Now look at the difference between those two. And if you're a funder, which one would you rather like to read? definitely that strong one, right? So think about, as you're quantifying it, how you can really tighten up that language and really speak to what your funders are going to want to read. Now, here's another handout that I'm going to gift to you guys. I have created this in a template form, okay, an outcome template form. If you fill in the blanks and you quantify everything, you're going to have a really strong outcome statement. Okay, I have this in template form in a document that we will be sending out to all of you. Okay, feel free to use it. I hope it is helpful for you. All right, once we speak about all of our goals, objectives, and outcomes, we have to tell them what we're going to do. That's what this next section is all about. The methods or the program plan, it is just an overview of our project design. It's the what we're going to do. It's the how we're going to do it. We're definitely going to tell them about the target population that we're going to serve. Now, you did part of that in your problem statement, so make sure you're not duplicating words that you've already said, but we're tying in how we are serving them, that target population. We're going to talk about our staffing here, right? Because they want to see that all of these programs are being provided by highly qualified staff with appropriate credentials, certifications, licensures, whatever the case may be for your particular project. So we're going to give our staffing and their credibility statements and qualifications. Where is this going to be located? What facilities are they going to be located in? Okay, paint a picture for your grant reviewers. They should be able to leave this section and not have any remaining questions in their head about what is going to happen with the funding that they give to you. Okay. And that means giving them a timeline. What's going to happen first? What's going to happen second? Within what time will you get things accomplished? If you are working collaboratively with other organizational partnerships, this is the place to put that and to define the roles of each of those different partners. Also, talk about why your methodology was chosen. Is it based on some sort of evidence-based practice? Has it been proven to be effective in other areas of the state, in other areas of the country? Why was your methodology chosen? Is it considered a gold standard in your field? Okay, talk about that. And then again, that kind of wow statement. What makes your service unique from others? There's always going to be other organizations out there providing similar services or similar services to similar populations, but what makes you stand out? Okay, that's going to be your wow statement in this particular section. Don't leave them confused at the end of this. Like, and I've seen people just always forget the basics. Basics like, well, what days of the week are you going to run the program and how many days per week and what are your hours going to be? Okay, don't forget about the basics in this section. As you're adding in all of your flowery language, it's kind of easy to do to forget about those basics. So don't forget that. Don't leave them hanging with questions. Then we're going to write our evaluation plan. So remember that we gave them all those goal statements, those measurable outcomes and objective statements. So those are the things that says, this is what we're going to accomplish. The evaluation plan tells them, how do we know whether or not we've accomplished it? Okay, this is our data collection and analysis procedures. And you see a list right there on your screen with multiple questions. I'll give you guys a little hint about how I write evaluation plans. You see this list right here? I go one by one by one by one and I answer them. Now, unless the RFP says differently, okay, if it says differently, then you answer their questions. But if it doesn't and it just says, give us an evaluation plan, I'm going to answer this. What data must I collect to answer my research question? My research question are those outcome and objective measures, okay? Who's going to participate in the evaluation? Is it my entire population that I'm serving? Is it a sample size? Is it a cohort that meets certain eligibility criteria? Who's going to participate in the evaluation? How am I going to collect that data? Is it pre and post tests? Is it self-report data? Is it observational data? Is it secondary data sources where I collect that data through police reports or hospital data or coroner's data or whatever the case may be, secondary data sources? When will I collect it, right? Is that at the start of the program, at the end? Is it midway through? Is it within 2 weeks? Is it within 3 months? Is it quarterly? Is it mid-year and year end? When am I going to collect the data? How will they be administered? Is it paper and pen? Is it now a web-based platform? Is it face-to-face interview style? Okay, how are they going to be administered? Once I have that data, how is it going to be stored? Keeping in mind all types of confidentiality and privacy measures, making sure that data cannot be released to other individuals, and how you're keeping that anonymous and confidential. And then how are you going to analyze it once you have the data? Are you using a third-party evaluator? Maybe you've partnered with a local university to do all your data analysis for you. And that's great. You would write that into your evaluation plan. If that's not the case, then you have to explain how you are internally going to analyze that data. I promise you, if you have answered all of these questions, you will have written a very comprehensive evaluation plan. Okay. There's always budgets. We have to submit a budget. I want you all to think about budgets as a program plan from a financial point of view. Okay, a program plan from a financial point of view. What this means is that there should never be anything in the budget that you have not already written into your narrative, into your proposal narrative. Okay, they have to coincide. It can be an educated projection of income and expenses. People always ask me the question, I've never run this program before. How do I know what it costs? It's an educated projection. You're doing your homework. You're looking at other organizations who've provided similar services, and you're figuring it out from an educated standpoint. If that funder has a budget template, and many of them do nowadays because they want the information in their format, use their template. And you're going to include both those direct expenses, those that directly correlate with your programming, your projects, your services, as well as your indirect expenses, which is your administrative overhead. Most funders will put a cap or a maximum on an indirects. The two funding organizations I worked for, that cap was always 10%. So 10% of your direct costs could be included as indirect. If they do not put a cap on it, never leave it out. That becomes a red flag for the funder, because they know it costs money to run a business, right? To run a nonprofit. So don't leave your indirects out thinking that makes you more competitive. Instead, put it in, but put it in at a very competitive rate. I'd say anywhere between 10 to 12% is really competitive. Okay. With that budget, you're also going to have to write a budget narrative. There's lots of different lingo for budget narratives. Some call it a budget justification, a justified budget, or a detailed budget. So they all mean the same thing. This is just a narrative to explain the individual pieces of your budget. So if you say you have copies to make, well, explain to us how you came up to that total amount in that line item for that budget. You can say, well, it's 1,000 copies and it's 10 cents per copy. Okay, you narratively explain that. You have a consultant or a contractor in there for 40 hours. Well, what exactly do you need that contractor for? What will that contractor or that consultant be doing? This is what you're writing into your narrative. This section doesn't always have to follow proper writing structure because you are explaining things mathematically. Sometimes you can't, but it needs to be really clear and really easy to read. Okay, that's the formatting of it is what's more important. And to make it really clear for clarity purposes, make sure it goes line item by line item. I used to, in my funding role, hold up the budget and hold up the budget narrative side by side, and I wanted it to go one by one. Staff, staff. Fringe benefits, equipment, travel. That way, I'm making it easier on the grant reviewer. They don't have to hop around and figure out where the narrative coincides with which line item of the budget. Okay. At some point in time, you'll write a proposal summary. Some of them call it an executive summary. This is typically positioned at the very beginning of the proposal. Now, I tell you, this section is very, very, very important. Remember when I said that some funders will very intentionally attempt to eliminate proposals? Absolutely, so they don't have to read them all. If your proposal summary, they can automatically see you're not going to meet their funders' priorities, you're not going to meet all the mandatory requirements, they may not even read your full proposal. Okay, that's why this section is so vastly important. This is not a section where you are introducing new information. Okay, if it is not in the proposal narrative, it shouldn't be in your summary. And it's easy to just put it in the order of your actual proposal. That's true, of course, unless the RFP says otherwise. Okay, in that way, you're kind of aligning it with that proposal narrative, and just do it last. Write your proposal narrative first, take out the most critical components in it to add to that proposal summary. And then at some point in time, we have to think about, are there attachments that we should be including? Okay. Again, I'm going to say if information is absolutely imperative, it needs to go in that proposal narrative, the actual narrative, not just in the attachments. There are some review processes that never even look at the attachments. Okay. So that's something to keep in mind. If you are adding a lot of attachments, make sure you page number them. We need this to be easy for the reviewers to read. If you have a ton of attachments, you can even include an index, okay? With all of that, you are being careful of page limitations. What does the RFP say as far as the number of pages? And do those pages, that page limitation include attachments, or does it not include attachments? Okay, be really cautious of that. And then the question I always get is, well, Andrea, they didn't ask for this information. Should I include it or should I not? I always say go back to the RFP. If it says you are welcome to include attachments that will give the reviewer more information about your organization or your program, then I'm all for it. Give them your annual report, send them a brochure or flyer of your programs, something that's going to add credibility and show your qualifications. But many of them will say, do not include additional attachments. And my rule has always been, if they don't say one way or the other, and I don't have the ability to ask them that question, then I do not include it. Okay, because I don't want to be disqualified just because of that. There you go. That was a lot of information in a short amount of time. Let me say one last thing before I end. There are 2 times when I celebrate when I'm grant writing. The first one is when I've submitted the grant. Whether I get it or not, I have accomplished something. I have thrown my blood, sweat, and tears into a product that is going to be beneficial for my organization at the end of the day. Okay. Because even if I don't get that award, I can build off of that proposal. And every time you rewrite, you copy and paste and you rewrite it, you edit it some more. You edit it and edit it and edit it. And powerful writing comes with a lot of editing. Okay. So don't feel bad. You have created something that you're going to build upon for future grant writing and grant seeking, and you're going to get awards from those in the future. And then the second one is when I get a grant award. Okay, don't forget to celebrate. You guys, those are accomplishments. You've competed with every other organization out there going after these same dollars and these same funders. You've done something really remarkable, and your organizations are going to use those funds to continue to meet the really vital, the really essential missions that you all have within your communities. Thank you so much for spending the time with me today. I was very proud to be invited to be here and to share just a couple of those tips and tricks for all of you. Good luck with all of your grant seeking efforts. I wish you well. You have my contact information as well. If you ever need to reach out, please feel free to do so. Thank you so much.
Andrea, that was a wonderful presentation full of a lot of information. So thank you so much. I'm Missy Beheimer, director here at Brady Ware, and we are going to start the Q&A section. So here we go. Let's start with the first one here. Why don't funders have the same or similar grant application process to ease the burden? Every single one of them is asking for different information in a different format. Been there, done that, drives us nuts.
Oh my goodness, wouldn't that be so nice?
Yes.
If we could just always have the same format for every single one. So let me tell you, a decade or so ago, there actually was a push through grant makers associations to have what was called a common grant application. And it was exactly for that reason. It's let's identify the most crucial information we want in every grant application and give this common grant application to grant seekers to ease the burden of their work. And there were a handful, including in the state of Ohio, there were a handful of grant makers that said, this is great, we're going to use this. And there were just as many who said, no, 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 no. We want autonomy. We want the information the way we want it. This common grant application doesn't give us the information that we want. And because obviously funders have that autonomy, they could choose whether or not to get on board with that common grant application or not. There are some states in the nation that were able to pull that off, and all the funders within that state hopped on board to that common grant application. Unfortunately, Ohio was not one of them.
Well, of course, we have to be complicated, don't we?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
And I always say truly the burden of the work falls to the grant seeker, not to the grant maker. If you guys have ever, you guys know the golden rule, right? Well, in grant writing, the golden rule is those who have the gold make the rules. Those who have the gold make the rules, right? We are the ones who have to jump through the hoops. And the hoops are defined by them.
Right.
And so the burden does fall to us because we're the ones who are requesting those funds. Yeah.
Yeah, very true. All right, we have another question. What are the most important grant readiness items to start with or to concentrate on?
Oh, the most important. You mean I have to like priority rank them?
Yeah.
That's really hard to do. I mean, and I say it's hard to do because funders want a well-rounded, highly credible organization and when I say highly credible, it's everything from your finances, it's your organizational infrastructure, like your human resources department, but then at a project or a program level, staffing level, those have to be really credible as well. I always tell, especially small nonprofit organizations, to start with their basic organizational infrastructure. Okay. When I ask an organization, do you have a human resources department? And they say no. I'm like, okay, we need to start working on developing your organizational policies and procedures. Do you have a solid board? Do you have board governance policies and procedures? And when they say no, it's like, okay, let's start working on board governance. Are you getting a third party financial audit? They say no. I'm like, okay, this is where we have to start working. And now let's look at your staffing qualifications. Do they hold accreditation, certain certifications, licensures? That would be really important for the type of service that they're providing. And if they say no, it's okay. We are starting from where we are at. There's nothing good or bad about it. If you're at the kind of ground floor because you're a new nonprofit or maybe you're a growing nonprofit, that's okay. We just have some work to do before we know that we are going to be really highly competitive when it comes to seeking grants.
You know, you mentioned something that I was thinking about as being, the treasurer or chair on some small boards, it always comes back to, do you have an audit? And are most of these grants require you to have an audit?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, more and more funders are now asking for copies of that audit.
Yeah.
Right. Just because, they don't want to take your word for it, but they really want you to prove it, particularly government funders. I've seen that to be included in the attachments with your proposal. Yeah, they at the end of the day, what they're doing is risk management.
Right.
They don't want to put their money into an organization that they feel is going to be highly risky. I have been in one situation while I was serving as a funder where we provided a grant award to an organization that ended up closing its doors. We had no way to get that money back, no way. And so, yeah, funders have to do risk management as well. They really want to make sure that their dollars are in good hands. Yeah.
Yeah. Makes it tricky for the smaller organizations. Next question, what is the best way to access how much money to ask for if this is a first-time funder?
Yeah, what a great question. A great question. The first thing before you ever even approach a funder or ever even begin a grant writing process with a particular funder is to do your research on that funder. Very first place I go to is their website. Most funders have them. There are some very small foundations that, believe it or not, in this day and age still do not have websites. So when that happens, it's okay to give them a call and have some questions with them. But yeah, look to see what their average awards have been in the past. Typically, there's a range. They'll say we have funded between this amount and this amount. If they say that their range is between 10,000 and 30,000, you do not want to go in with a request for $100,000.
Right.
Okay. So
Yeah.
yeah, do that research and find out what their range is so that you can be right there in the middle of that range. And then I typically follow that up with a phone call or a question to that funder where I say to them, I've reviewed your website and I see that the typical award range is between 10,000 and 30,000. Do you think that that's still acceptable if I put in a request for 25,000? And then sometimes that opens a door for a conversation.
Yeah. Great advice. Next question. How long should an organizational profile be?
Oh, God, oh goodness, every single grant is different, every single one. So it depends, right? Because if you are writing for a foundation where your total narrative can't be longer than 2 pages, that's different than a large federal grant where you have up to 20, 25 pages to write. Um, with that said, it's not a section that you want to go on and on and on and on and on about, right? Because you do always have limitations, whether it's page limitation, word limitation, character limitations, there's always some sort of limitation. You want to spend your limited space as wisely as possible. Okay, so your organizational profile should hit all of those really important historical information about your organization, your mission and vision statement, who you serve, why you exist, your wow statements, your accreditations, your credibility, all of that. Do all of that and then move on to the next section and use that limited space to really build up your project design and your outcome measurements, right? Because that's their return on investment
Right.
and they want to know what their ROI is at the end of the day. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Where are the best places to find grants besides looking at local companies and community foundations? Are there other methods you recommend to find grants? Isn't that the hard, where do you even start to look for them?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
so honestly, it depends on what level of grants you're talking about. Are you talking about foundations? Are you talking about government grants? So here's the gist of it, right? There's a part of the grants field that we call prospect research, which is just looking for potential funding opportunities. When I'm doing prospect research for organizations, here are the things that I do. I do for federal government grants, I do what's called a grants.gov search. Okay, so all federal funding opportunities are put into one centralized portal where you can put in key terms and it'll pop up funding opportunities that meet the requirements of those key terms that you put in. So grants.gov for federal government grants. State government grants, get on as many email distribution listservs as you can for the state departments that do release funding. So whether that, and that is in alignment with your mission, right? So whether that's the Ohio Department of Education, the Ohio Department of Health, the Ohio Department of Criminal Justice Services, okay, figure out how to get on those state email distribution listservs so that you can get whatever releases of funding opportunities that they do. For foundations, then, there are lots of different paid subscriptions that you all can get. Those are paid, typically an annual subscription that will centralize all that information into one portal. And so you can just go in and do a key term search for that. The one that I recommend, they're not paying me to say this. This is the one I recommend, is called the Foundation Directory Online, or the FDO. It's run through the Foundation Center. It is a paid subscription unless you happen to be near what's called a cooperative collection, which typically lands in public libraries. Then you can go to that public library and you can access the Foundation Directory Online there at your public library, and you can do it for free. So the easiest ways to go about doing what is a monumental job. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. Okay, next question. Is it true that no more than 10 to 15% of the overall budget should be grant-based?
of the overall, say that one more time for me,
Is
Missy.
is it true that no more than 10 to 15% of the overall budget should be grant-based? I'm
The
assuming you're
overall
talking about for the organization.
program budget or organizations, but yeah. So if we're looking organizationally, I think that there is some truth to that. The fact is you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket.
Right.
You want to diversify your funding sources. No funder wants to be a sole funder of an entire program or an entire organization,
Yeah.
because we know that grant funds are vulnerable. They're vulnerable to shifts in the stock market. They are vulnerable to shifts in certain tax bases, depending on if we're talking public or private dollars. They're vulnerable and they can go away. Funders oftentimes themselves have no control over that. Right. So if in the event that that pot of money goes away, they don't want to think like that entire program is going to dissolve. And if it is a human service or social service type program, now you're thinking about the impact that that has to the people's lives who are being served by those funding sources. So yes, 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 diversify your funding sources, not just grants. You want to diversify your grant sources as well, but other types of discretionary fundraising as well, whether that's planned giving or it's annual events or it's donor solicitation or whatever the case may be. Yes, yes, every really financially healthy nonprofit organization should have a nice balance between those discretionary fundraising tactics as well as grants.
All right, next question. If a nonprofit is fairly new, what are the best steps for becoming more competitive to secure grants?
Yeah, I honestly, this is the number one question I get from small nonprofits all the time. Let me say that over again. What I really get is they contact me and they say, "Can you write a grant for us and get some money?"
Yeah.
And when I start digging into figuring out where are they in regards to grant readiness, then I help them to take a step back. And I say, look, in doing this assessment, I see that you are not quite grant ready yet. So and I know that this isn't the fun stuff to do, and this is not the sexy stuff, right? When it comes to organizational development processes, but it is the stuff, the work, the efforts it's going to get your organization to a point where when you do start to grant seek, you're going to be more successful at it, right? And time is money. Right. So if you are spinning your wheels and spending staff time or your time going after grant after grant after grant, and you're just getting rejections, you're wasting money. You're wasting your organization's money. So go back to that grant readiness checklist, do some really honest self-assessments of your organization, identify where your gaps are, and start filling in those gaps. If you need some help with that, there are lots of nonprofit leadership type consultants out there that can help with that type of work as well, not just grants, but with building your basic nonprofit organizational infrastructure. Do that first, and then you will be much more competitive when you do seek grant.
Yeah. All right. If we have one project that is in need of grant funding, should we apply to multiple funders for the same project?
Oh my goodness, yes. A resounding yes. Yes. So my rule always, particularly if there's small pots of money, if I'm going after, I'll give you an example. I very recently wrote a handful of grant applications for an organization that needed some gym equipment. Right, they were building a fitness center into it was a healthcare provider, but they were building a fitness center into their healthcare system. And I think we applied to 3 different foundations for the exact same thing. Number one, you're never going to get awards from every single one that you write. It's just not possible, not every single one of them. And so you always have something to fall back on. Okay, well, we didn't get the first 2, but look, we got the third one. Okay, now we're good to go. Now, in the event that you do get more than one award for the exact same thing, what a great problem to have,
Yeah.
right? Then,
Exactly.
then, and I've done this on multiple occasions. I've gone back to the funder and I've said, thank you so much for awarding these dollars to us. But I am very happy to say that we did write to multiple funders and we were able to secure dollars elsewhere. If it is okay with you, for us to pivot and use these dollars in a different way, can I propose this to you? And I've always got something else in mind where I'm going to say, instead of using the dollars for fitness equipment, we'd like to use it for this.
Yeah,
And they can say no. They can say no, we're just going to take our award back and we're going to award those to someone else. And you know what? That's okay because you were awarded by another foundation for that project. But oftentimes, once those grant reviewers have gone through that process, they don't want to go through it again. And so
right.
if they are happy with your plan B, they can go, sure, spend it on plan B.
Yeah,
And you're
yeah.
like, yay,
Good problem to have.
double award. Yeah.
All
Right.
right, next question. Do you have any suggestions of ways to market funders' logos and their brand that are valuable to funders? Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what type of service, what type of project that you're running. Always, 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 if this is the type of funder that wants to be marketed, typically your corporate foundations, typically your public foundations, oftentimes your like your local and state government foundations will like that as well, because oftentimes they have levies on the ballots and they want people to know what they're doing. So good
Yeah,
stuff. 100% always do press releases. That press release is always going to have their logo. It's going to talk about where the award dollars came from. So that's the one place. If you are ever providing a type of service where you have to recruit customers, clients, then you're going to be creating flyers, brochures, handouts, put every single one of their logos, excuse me, every single one of their logos on documents. So
yes,
again, flyers, if you do advertisements, whether that's billboards or radio PSAs, you're always going to include it in that. And then if you are doing any level of capital funding, right? So that would be buildings, vehicles, equipment. You can have it branded on the side of a building. You can put it on the side of your van. I did one time where I wrote a grant to get handicap disabled swing sets for an outdoor play area, but they were handicap abled, and I had a cement post that had the logo of the funder at the very corner of that playground area. And I wrote that into the grant application because I knew this was a funder that wanted to be
right.
marketed. And cha-ching, right?
Yeah.
It worked. It worked. Yeah, yeah.
Awesome. Let's do one more here. How do you stay on the radar of funders either before or after you've submitted the grant application to them?
Yeah, great question. Great question. Because I always say there's far more to grant writing than just sitting down at your computer and starting to type, right? And people don't always understand it. Honestly, it's why in the field we call ourselves grant professionals, not just grant writers, because there's so much more that goes into it. And part of that is cultivating relationships with funders. At the end of the day, funders are human too. They want to build positive, trusting relationships with the people and the organizations that they are ultimately going to fund because they want to be able to sit in that secured space where they know that they're giving their money, their funds over to organizations that they can trust to do their due diligence and to spend those dollars well. Well, trust building takes time. It takes time. So, particularly your local funders where relationship is everything, where, especially local communities where everybody knows everybody kind of thing. And if you are in one particular part of a social service where there's limited number of organizations in that particular sector or that field, everybody knows everybody, and your reputation means everything, and building that relationship means everything. So you may have multiple face-to-face meetings with a funder just to get to know them
Hmm.
before you ever ask them for a funding award, right? And what you're doing is you're telling them about the great work of your organization. You should sound passionate in those meetings. You should really talk about how your organization is meeting the needs of this community, and then after that, you're going to periodically send them an email. And that email is going to tell them about some great event you have coming up. It may be giving them an annual newsletter. It's telling them, look, we had this great success story, and here's a great success. And so you are staying on their radar even when you haven't even asked them for funding. And then after you've asked them for funding and you've gotten an award, you're going to continue. You're going to continue to cultivate that relationship. You're going to continue to communicate with them. I tell you, in the 13 years that I spent as a funder, I could tell you the difference between those organizations that actively stayed in contact with me to help me to understand the good work they were doing, and those that kind of got the money and then ghosted me, you know,
Yes.
and then I never hear from them ever again. Well, when they go to reapply for funding, which happens often, who do you think the funder is going to be more likely to fund?
Yeah.
It's going to be that
Yep.
organization that has built that really positive relationship with them. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna squeeze one more in here.
Okay.
This
Okay.
year, our organization wrote a grant and then COVID numbers spiked. Is it better to push the program back or approach the funder and see if they want to change the event? It just seems like there could be pros and cons for both.
Yeah, again, go back to that funder and say, here are our two options.
Yeah,
We would love to continue with this event, but because we are following a proper safety protocol, this is how we're going to do it in a safe way. Are you comfortable with that? Another option is that we push the event back and we do it at a different time, and then just allow that funder to tell you their thoughts about it. I tell you, many of the funders, just as we have as organization, had to pivot our services and find new ways of continuing to provide services in a new, climate that none of us were expecting. The funders had to do the same thing.
yeah,
And they didn't just stop giving out funds, but they started giving out funds in a way that they knew met COVID protocol.
yeah,
So that people could still receive the services, but receive the services in a way that kept people safe from harm.
yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah, I think if you have a way to say we're still going to do it, but we're going to do it according to safety protocol, and your funder is okay with that, then let's do that. But always give them the option. But if you don't think that's okay, then we'd be okay with pushing it back 3 months or pushing it back 6 months if that's okay with you as well. See what their thoughts are about it.
yeah. Well, thank you, Andrea. This has been, I mean, just full of such great information. I'm sure there are going to be more questions and they have your contact information, so I'm sure you would be more than willing to email answer them. So this is going to wrap up our Q&A session. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. You will receive an email with downloads for your handouts. You'll get the copy of the video so you can watch, you can share with your staff, your board members, so do that. There will be a survey, so please do that for us here at Brady Ware so we can make sure we can continue to provide valuable information. We have another session next Tuesday, work-life balance tips for the nonprofit leader. Oh my, that maybe we all need that one, by Beth Cantor. So be sure to register and attend, and we hope to see you all there. And Andrea, thank you again for your time. It was a wonderful presentation. We really appreciate